paranoid, gangster-ridden degeneracy kind of climate that it was in the New York City area, primarily in the 50s through the 1960s. And the main character of this book really is Ernie Schlegel. I say main character as though it's a novel, but this is a nonfiction book. He's a real guy that I met about 8 years ago in a bowling alley. And the first thing he says to me, this is a guy with this really distinct Manhattan accent, and he goes, "I'm the greatest hustler that ever lived." And from that moment forward, I knew I had a character on my hands. I knew I may have a book in here too. And then when I realized that at age 21 he was indicted for attempted murder for planting a knife in a kid's chest in an argument over $20 in a Brooklyn bowling alley, I knew for certain that I had something that I could work with here. Okay, that's Ernie Schlegel. This is a guy who was a legendary hustler in New York City. He would do anything he could or had to make a buck. It was all about the money, nothing else. It wasn't about the drama, although a lot of drama was associated with his efforts at making as much money as he could. For example, he would rub some bourbon behind his ears and take a shot before walking into a bowling alley so people would think he's drunk and think, "Oh, I got this drunk, I'm going to take him to the cleaners, challenge him, double or nothing, whatever I got to do." And soon those people realized that they were either tragically overestimating their own ability or tragically underestimating Ernie's. And he usually got the better of them, all right? I mean, one time he walked into a bowling alley on crutches telling people he had the gout and bowled anyway, and big surprise, eventually he left the place with more money than he had when he arrived, you know? So that's the kind of world that we're dealing with. But the problem for Ernie at this point in his life, when he was in his mid-20s at this point, was he couldn't get a match in New York City where he was from. People knew he was really good, and no amount of bullshit was going to convince him otherwise by then, okay? So he ended up having to leave town and go far and wide to find matches, to find willing challengers that didn't maybe know him or hadn't yet heard of Ernie Schlegel. Maybe the word hadn't come down Route 1 from New York City to Philly and South Jersey, so he could kind of take advantage of that ignorance. But this one night, he got a taste of just how difficult things had become for this hustler that he had been for so long. He goes down to Philadelphia, where he had heard there was a fish. Anyone who's familiar with gambling parlance knows a fish is just that, right? A guy who thinks he's better than he is, or doesn't understand how good his opponent is, and ultimately becomes really easy prey. These matches were known as action bowling matches, and the action, anyone who's familiar with gambling knows, you know, when someone says, "I went in on that action," they're talking about the money, they're talking about the bet. It doesn't have to be bowling. It can be anything. It's the action itself. I mean, when these guys were action bowling on the lanes, there would be kids in the parking lot pitching dice. There would be guys betting on cards at the lunch counter, anything. I mean, they would bet on, some of these kids would bet on who would have the most attractive woman sit next to them on the subway going home. I mean, anything. I mean, there was a guy, Richie Hornreich, who used to bet on which raindrop would slide down the window the fastest at Bay Ridge Lanes in Brooklyn, where I'm from. Okay? That's how degenerate these people were. I remember Ernie one time was telling about this guy named Mike Lemongello, and he said, "Mikey, he would bet on which cockroach would run the fastest than the other one up the block." You know, that's how these guys work, okay? And so Ernie went down to Philly this one night with this guy named Toro Nagai, who was this diminutive Japanese restaurateur in the Columbia University area of New York City, who would take him down in his black Cadillac because Ernie and his backers didn't have cars. They were kids. Toro had a car, man. That was badass. All right, so they hooked up with Toro, and he had maybe a little money to back Ernie up. But even if he didn't, he's paying the gas. He's paving the way for Ernie to get the hell out of New York and find someone who didn't know him so he could challenge him to a match. So they heard that there was a fish in Philly. Specifically, the person who heard that was Ernie's buddy Steve Harris, who would bet on Ernie in action matches constantly. Very smart, shrewd gambler. And what they found in Philly and eventually in South Jersey was that maybe things weren't quite, I don't know, as easy as Ernie had hoped they would be, or perhaps times were changing a little bit, and Ernie was going to have to figure something else out to make a living. So this is what happened when they went down to Philly this one night looking for a fish and some easy money. They end up finishing this match with this guy in Philadelphia, and the guy says this: "It was a pleasure bowling you guys," he said. "If you want to really make some money, there's a bowling alley out on Route 1 in New Jersey called Federal Lanes. Ask the manager there. He'll bowl anybody for any amount. He's a superstar in that bowling alley, but you're better than him, and you can take him. So why don't you go there? Call it the voice of greed. Call it the voice of the devil himself. But whatever force compelled that Philadelphia fish to lure them down Route 1, Schlegel and the boys heard it loud and clear. Down Route 1 they went in the pitch darkness of night. They would find the fish they went looking for at Federal Lanes, but they also would find the kind of people who only come out at night, the ones who will just as soon plant a blade in your eye as they will shake your hand. It was 1 in the morning by the time the caddy pulled up to Federal Lanes. They found the manager closing up shop for the night, but they didn't come to help the guy mop his floors and turn out the lights. They came to relieve him of his cash. They asked him if he wanted to bowl, told him they heard he liked action. Sure, he said. They started bowling. That, as Schlegel and the boys were about to learn, was their first mistake. Once again, Nagai's prize pony performed well enough to recoup every dime of gas money he spent to take them there and then some, besting the quote superstar for hours on end until the first glow of dawn blanched the bowling alley windows. This guy was no pretender like the one who couldn't even take down Richie Solomon back at Jimmy Dykes' place in Philly. This was a real bowler, a good bowler. Still, Schlegel was better. By 5 in the morning, the manager called it quits. Then the chumps walked in. They were a gang of kids in their mid to late teens looking to keep the match going by putting their money on the manager. Harris knew a fish when he smelled one, and these kids reeked of it. But he also knew exhaustion when he felt it. By the time the kids arrived, Harris had fallen asleep in the settee area behind another pair of lanes, spent by the long day of traveling far and wide to find places where the fish dwelled. Schlegel decided he would indeed resume the match. Harris told this new school of fish he would cover whatever bets they had. The kids started putting up $7 here, $3 there. They were the kinds of small bets Schlegel wasn't used to back home. But there were at least 8 of these kids, and between all of them plus what the manager was betting, it was an okay bet. After 24 hours of shutting the biggest mouths in bowling alleys from Philly to South Jersey without so much as a minute's sleep in the meantime, all it took was, quote, an okay bet to rouse Steve Harris from his half-conscious slumber. That's all it ever took when you were in on the action. After all, it was gambling that sent Schlegel and the boys down Route 1 to Jimmy Dykes' place. Gambling that sent them deep into South Jersey on the trail of the fish they smelled there. Gambling that roused Harris from his sleep the moment a pack of hoods with change to spare emerged from the night. Schlegel laced up his shoes again. Harris tallied all the money the kids dared to spare on a man who had no answer for Ernie Schlegel. The machine set yet another rack of pins, and the games once again began. By now, the superstar that Harris and Schlegel heard about back in Philly looked like little more than a super sucker. His next few games did nothing to demonstrate otherwise. Schlegel beat him again. The guy called it quits, and the night finally was over. Or so Harris thought. Some of the bowlers Harris knew back home might take a bad night of losses in stride and try their luck again the following night. But the boys Harris did business with down in Jersey were the kind who did not wait until next time to get their money back. No, these were the kinds of gamblers who only lost when they agreed to, who only went home with empty pockets if the other guy brought bigger knives than they did. Schlegel packed his ball and shoes again. Harris slipped back into the half-sleep he'd fallen into before these kids came looking around to score. And that is when the night they never would forget began. Harris heard the sound of kids slamming bowling balls into the floor and damning to hell the New York hustlers Toro Nagai had brought to town. Only feigning sleep now, Harris listened as the kids openly discussed the speed and trajectory at which a bowling ball must be thrown to blow open a grown man's head like a butternut squash at a shooting range. That, of course, was the end even of the pretense of sleep. That, perhaps, was the moment Harris found himself more fully awake than ever before. A realization that the next time you do catch some sleep may in fact be the last time will tend to do that to you. Harris stood up. "What's your problem?" he asked the kids. "We're not hustlers. We didn't come here pretending we didn't know how to bowl, asking you if you'll teach us how to bowl like they do in a pool hall. We came in and Ernie said, 'Do you want to bowl?' That means he's good. We know the manager's good and Ernie's good. That's not hustling. Ernie beat him fair and square." Mere reason may have been enough to get them out of jams back in New York City. But down in South Jersey, reason was no match for a knife. The shortest kid among them busted out a blade. Switchblade knives were popular in those days, but this was something closer to a box cutter. When the kid pushed a button, the blade came straight out, and it was half an inch wide, like a razor blade. He pressed the blade against Harris's belly and explained exactly what he intended to do with it. "You're gonna die, motherfucker," he told the kid. Harris shut his mouth. This was new territory for him. Schlegel and the guy were gathering their belongings several lanes away with their backs turned, oblivious. As Harris stood in faro lanes with a blade pressed against him, he knew this was not the first time an action bowler had ended up on the wrong end of a gangster's knife, and he knew it would not be the last. Before the kid made good on his promise to send Harris on a one-way trip out of this world, he had a question for him. "Are you a Jew?" the kid said. This was a question Harris heard too many times before. He thought of the winter mornings he descended into the subway station tunnel on his walk to school to avoid the cold in his native Inwood, then a predominantly Irish neighborhood, and the Irish Catholic kids who would wait on the other side to beat him because their parents told him the Jews killed Jesus. He remembered how petrified he was to walk those streets with the velvet bag that contained his talit, the Jewish prayer shawl he received on his bar mitzvah, which he took with him to temple up the block on the high holy days. How he would hold it close to his body so the neighborhood bullies would not see the Star of David embroidered on it. Jewish kids growing up in the Inwood of Harris's youth knew they were in for a beating if they dared enter any of the neighborhood's 73 Irish pubs. Good Shepherd Church, near the bustling intersection of 207th Street and Broadway, hosted no less than 14 masses packed with Irish Catholics every Sunday. And a xenophobic paranoia thickened the air with rumors about the Negroes moving in and the jobs and homes they would steal from the Irish families who had lived there for generations. The Black, Puerto Rican, and Jewish children of Inwood grew up with a nagging feeling they were some foreign presence discourteously taking up residence on somebody else's turf. To be different from the rest on those streets, and especially to have had the audacity to be born a Jew, was to live your life as a marked man. And now, a couple hours down the road from all that, here was a South Jersey hood with his knife pressed to Harris's gut, and a question all too familiar from to a kid from those angry streets back home. Maybe for the first time in his life, he found himself yearning for those days when the worst thing he had to worry about was what to say to his mother when he made it back home just before dawn. Maybe that freedom he went chasing when he left her house for good also was something to fear. Persuading the kid he had not been hustled had been worth a shot, but there was not much Harris could do about his Jewishness. His first instinct was to tell the kid that no, he was not a Jew. But then he figured that if being Jewish was the thing he was about to die for, he would rather die proudly than a coward. "Yes, I am," Harris told the kid. "What about it?" For a moment, everyone went silent. "No shit," the kid said. "Me too. Give me 5. The hood put away the blade and stuck out his hand. Harris could not believe it. He hesitated a moment and slapped him 5. Then he noticed the kid's expression change. Harris said, "What's wrong?" The kid mewed pathetically about not having enough money for breakfast. If enough money to buy breakfast was all it would take to spare Harris's life, then breakfast was precisely what these boys would get. Harris learned enough on the streets of New York City to know a can't-miss deal when he saw one. He promptly curled off $30 from his roll of the night's winnings, easily enough in those days to buy breakfast every day for the next week. And just as quickly, he and Schlegel followed the guy out of the place, making sure to offer a few kind goodbyes for good measure. Nagai's Cadillac may have been the reason Schlegel and the boys headed down Route 1 that night, but there was another reason they liked having the old man along when they went fishing. They knew they could count on him to deliver an ass-kicking as much as they could count on him for a ride. Nagai may have been older and smaller, but he was a guy you did not mess with. Nagai and his cohorts were at least as tough as any of the gangsters they encountered in bowling alleys. One of Nagai's buddies, who stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed about 150 pounds, was once held up by a few muggers who were twice his size. He told them he had $8, and that he would give each of them $2 and keep the last $2 for bus money to get home. The muggers did not particularly care for diplomacy, however, and demanded all the dough. Seconds later, the biggest of the 3 was out cold on the ground, and the other 2 were running as fast as they could. Nagai was like that, having trained in martial arts himself. Just as Harris and Schlegel made it to the guy's car in the parking lot, they found themselves confronted by the whole gang they thought they had bought off inside. Only now they were armed to the teeth with chains, knives, pipes, and various other implements of persuasion. In the few minutes it took to reach the car, it dawned on the gang that if a knife flash got them $30, a real fight would get them even more. Fortunately, the only weapons Nagai usually needed were his own bare hands, and he managed to nearly single-handedly take on the entire gang, with Harris and Schlegel heading for Nagai's Cadillac. When you lose, that should be a lesson to you, Nagai admonished with a scowl as he performed a brutal karate chop on the fender of another parked car. Then Nagai told Schlegel and the boys it was time to get the hell out of there. He knew as well as they did that scaring the hoods was a great way of attracting more of them. Nagai twisted the keys in the ignition of his Cadillac, and as he pulled off into the street, lifted a long iron bar from under his seat and twirled it around his head. From their vantage point, the gangsters must have sworn he was wielding a gun. If the objective was not to scare the poor bastards, then at that point they considered the night a total failure, because fear attracted more teens looking for a fight like moths to a porch light. The guy screamed up Route 1 at about 80 miles an hour with a car full of hoods on his tail. They pursued the Cadillac for nearly 40 miles, only then finally conceding that the money they put on the wrong man that night was money they would never see again. Neither Harris nor Schlegel ever considered taking weapons of their own into bowling alleys after that, because the incident was such an aberration in their experience. It was also the last Nagai and the boys would ever see of federal lanes. It was not, however, the last time a coterie of young gamblers went out looking for action and instead found themselves on the wrong end of a gangster's weapon. As 1962 drew to a close, one bowling alley in Brooklyn, New York was emerging as a place where the trouble was at least as plentiful as the treasure. Those who walked the precarious line between the two had stories to tell for the rest of their lives. That's it.